Hello, Rob Venier, and today we're talking about ethnicity and postcolonial theory by Paul Gilroy. So in this session we'll be introduced to Paul Gilroy's theories on ethnicity and postcolonial theory, specifically the ideas that colonial discourses continue to inform contemporary attitudes to race and ethnicity in the postcolonial era, and civilizationism constructs racial hierarchies and sets up binary oppositions based on notions of otherness. Paul Gilroy was a student of Stuart Hall, so there are links to Stuart Hall's theories. Obviously, we are going to be talking about some issues that are very contentious and could be considered offensive. We are talking about racism, for example, obviously. So when we're discussing this, of course, we need to be bearing in mind that we need to be talking in a way that's not going to offend anybody. Let's have a bit of historical context. Britain, about a century ago, had an empire. The British Empire, at its height, was the largest empire in history. And for over a century, it was the foremost global power. We were the most powerful country in the world. By 1913, so just before World War I, the British Empire held sway over 412 million people, which was 23% of the world population at the time. So we're talking about a quarter of everybody alive on Earth at that time was part of the British Empire. By 1920, it covered 13,700,000 square miles. That's 24% of the Earth's total land area. It was gigantic. To such an extent that British school children were taught to paint the map red, red being the colour of the British Empire. It was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire because it was always daylight somewhere in one of our many colonies. This is a map of all the various countries that once upon a time were owned by Britain. Not necessarily all at the same time, but at one time or another. As you can see, it's a very large percentage of the world's population, and bearing in mind that many of the countries in this map aren't to scale. India, for example, and Canada are a lot bigger in reality than they appear on this map. The countries that are owned by an empire are called as colonies. And one of the key terms you need to know about is the idea of colonialism. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it commercially. In other words, what the British Empire did was invade a country, defeat it militarily, take it over, send settlers to settle it, and run it as if it belonged to us. We would then spend the entire time we were there robbing it blind and treating its populace as at best second-class citizens and at worst slaves. To be fair to the British Empire, we were nowhere near as bad as many of the other European empires. Belgians in particular were particularly vile in their colonies. It's not in any way to excuse what we got up to, but it's just to create a bit of historical context. Today, there's very little left of this empire. It all fell apart after World War II, when you'd be fighting a war against German imperial aggression. It starts to look pretty hypocritical when you've got the world's largest empire. Britain was also broke and couldn't afford to run its empire anymore. So there was a process of decolonization as country after country got independence from the UK. This was a gradual process. It started in 1945 but didn't really completely finish until 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to China. There are a few British overseas territories left, as you can see from this map, but they're mostly tiny little islands that nobody's ever heard of unless they've been there on holiday. Now, we are now in what's called a post-colonial world. Post-colonialism is the political or cultural condition of a former colony, and a theoretical approach in various disciplines that's concerned with the lasting impact of colonization on its former colonies. Now, according to Paul Gilroy, we have what's called a colonial discourse. Remember, discourse means a discussion in culture, in society. So he says the colonial discourses continue to inform contemporary attitudes towards race and ethnicity in a post-colonial era. Here we have an image of that kind of sums up colonial British attitudes towards its colonial subjects. Here we have a white British colonial master, this is in India I believe, treating the locals as servants. They are his servants. Paul Gilroy would argue that that's still how we tend to think of people from our former colonies. And indeed, we tend to continue to behave as if we were a colonial power, looking down on, patronising non-white British people and non-white foreigners in particular, and thinking that we still have a colonial superiority. This, of course, results in a great deal of racism. Now, after the war, there was a manpower shortage in this country. There was not enough people to fill all the jobs that needed filling. And so we had the first wave of immigration into the country, mostly from the West Indies and the Caribbean. As lots of Caribbean and West Indies black people who considered themselves to be British at this point, it was still part of the British Empire as such, still Commonwealth countries today, came to Britain to find work. This resulted in the beginnings of true multicultural society in Britain. It was a trickle at first, but it got gradually bigger and bigger as time went on. That's not to say there haven't been non-white people living in Britain for millennia, going back as far as the Roman occupation. But this is the beginnings of modern immigration. But for Paul Gilroy, multicultural society seems to have been abandoned at birth. There's a utopian idea that people who considered themselves British, had been brought up and told that they were British, would come to live in the motherland, Britain, and expect to be treated as British. But when they got here, they were treated as foreigners and were subjected to a great deal of racism. There's an interesting article here, I thought, however. This is from the Daily Mail, ironically, which is, let's face it, not the most liberal of publications. Let's face it, the guy who invented it was a friend of Hitler, right? Ethnic minorities are more likely to feel British than white people, says a recent study. And it goes on to explain that 51% of blacks and Asians describe themselves as British compared to 29% of white people. Being the Daily Mail, they go on to complain about this, as British white people apparently are much more likely to consider themselves as English, Scottish, Welsh or Irish rather than British as such. Typical Daily Mail being quite racist about something you probably think was a good thing. Now, the other key point he talked about was this idea of civilization and otherness. Now, this idea of the other, it means those who are different from us. It's a term borrowed from Edward Said, the famous writer of the book Orientalism. And basically this is breaking the world up into civilizations, civilized versus uncivilized, us versus them. So it's a binary opposite of Claude Levi-Strauss would call it. So Gilroy's talking about the idea that civilizationism constructs racial hierarchies, in other words, structures of power. So it's basically saying we have power. It's the idea that white British people are superior to the colonials. And it doesn't just apply to, persons of colour. When you think about it, British people also had a sense of superiority over their white colonial subjects. Consider the Australians, for example. Here we've got pictures showing a British attitude towards us and them, and Edward Said talked about Orientalism and about people from the Orient as being considered to be at best exotic and at worst frightening. And here we've got British soldiers fighting against or oppressing colonial subjects. And Gilroy talks about the idea that old colonial issues come back into play when geopolitical conflicts are specified as battles between homogenous civilizations. What do we mean by this? Well, by homogenous we mean one big group. So we're talking perhaps about, lumping people together, stereotyping them. We can look at Islam and Muslims, for example, and talk. People talk about them as if it's a race. Well, it's not. It's a religion. People of all sorts of nationalities, ethnicities, count themselves as Muslim. White people, black people, South Asian people, African people, all can be Muslims. It's not a race, right? So, but we tend to simplify things in Western discourses as, whites versus non-white, for example. Here we got two images here of British forces in Afghanistan on the left in 1879 and Britain and the right in 2014, suggesting that little has changed. We tend to fall back on our old colonial behaviour. I remember back when, when the invasion of Afghanistan first happened, which was in 2003, if I remember rightly. The British arrogantly suggesting that they would be very good at occupying Iraq because they had a history of, colonial policing, most recently at that point in places like Northern Ireland. Didn't work out like that though. So according to Paul Gilroy, Great Britain has failed to mourn its loss of empire. Britain's post-imperial, post-colonial melancholia demonstrates its failure to let go of a long-gone imperial past. This is reproduced in the present as an imperial impulse. What he's basically saying is Britain hasn't really got over the fact that we've lost our empire and that we're not as important in the world as we once were. Britain likes to think of itself as a world power. We remember the days when we ruled Britannia and how we ruled the waves and we were the most powerful nation on earth. Well, we're not anymore, not by a long shot. And this makes us melancholy, sad. And we still hark back to those days of imperial glory. On the right here, we've got a photograph I took back in an air show in 1991, after the first Gulf War, of the late 80s, early 90s. And as you can see, the nose art painted on this plane is named The Empire Strikes Back, which of course is an intertextual reference to the second Star Wars movie. That's Julia Kristeva theory, remember? But, it's this idea of, once again, the British Empire flying off to Iraq, which, let's face it, was a former British colony, to sort it out. It's actually pretty racist. For Paul Gilroy, the target of this imperial impulse is the immigrant. He used the ancient name for Britain, Albion, to describe Britain. And he said, Albion's criminalisation of immigrants and their progeny, that means their children, their offspring, particularly from the Caribbean and South Asia, signifies a melancholic response to these social and political groups that are essential to late modern life. it's about this idea that despite being a multicultural society where there are people from all over the world, especially the former British Empire, the modern Commonwealth, living in this country, we struggle to deal with the idea that people from other cultures would be coming into Britain and changing the nature of what it means to be British. We feel threatened by that. Our old-fashioned, outdated idea of what Britishness is threatened by immigration. Since Paul Gilroy wrote his book, of course, the big moral panic and folk devil of the current age is about Eastern European immigration. This is obviously a major factor behind the Brexit vote to leave the EU. The fear whipped up by tabloid newspapers like the Daily Mail about foreigners coming into the country, most of which is pure lies. And Britain is struggling to come to terms with this, Brexit being a perfect example of that. Here we've got another quite racist Daily Mail cover. I say quite racist, very racist Daily Mail cover, illustrating what we're talking about. At the moment, and you'll know this from your PUDS lessons this week, obviously British values are something that's being very much promoted by the government at this point as a means to combat racism and extremism in this country. And as part of our British values commitment, the college is of course promoting the things that they say are, or the Ofsted say are fundamental British values. Now these would include things like democracy, the rule of law, the right to individual freedom and liberty, but especially mutual respect for and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs and for those without faith. But interestingly in this list there's no mention of racism as such, or sexism, or homophobia, or any other kind of, persecution and oppression and bigotry. It talks about mutual respect and tolerance, but it only does so in respect to religion. Seems like a bit of an oversight to me. Obviously, we need to remember that we may have been an empire once upon a time, but those days are long gone. That everybody in our society, no matter what their race, creed, ethnicity, sexuality, age, gender, social class, whatever, everyone has the right to mutual respect and tolerance. So, just to remind you, when we are discussing these issues in class, we need to do so in a safe environment of respect for everybody. So, there's some other videos on Edward Syed that you can watch and his idea of Orientalism. They are there mainly to support Paul Gilroy's theory. That's the main one you need to know. If you've got any questions, you know where I am, and I'll talk to you next time.